My name is Mary, though everyone around these parts calls me Granny Mary. I'm 76 years old, and I'm sitting in my favorite wicker chair on the front porch of my little yellow house on Magnolia Avenue, watching the late afternoon sun filter through the dogwood trees that line my quiet street. There's a gentle breeze stirring the wind chimes that hang from the porch ceiling, creating a soft melody that usually brings me peace. But today, that peace feels fragile, like something I have to hold on to carefully while I tell you about the darkest 48 hours of my life. I've got my hands wrapped around a cup of sweet tea that's gone warm in the humid Kentucky air, and there's a photo album sitting open in my lap, pictures of children and grandchildren who filled my later years with joy and laughter. But today, I'm not looking at those happy faces. Today, I'm thinking about something that happened 37 years ago, when I was 39 years old, and learned that sometimes the people we trust most completely are the ones most capable of destroying us. You see, there's a particular kind of terror that comes from being trapped, helpless, at the mercy of someone who claims to love you but whose love has turned into something twisted and dangerous. It's not just the physical fear, though that's real enough. It's the psychological devastation of realizing that the person you've trusted with your heart, your home, your very life is capable of taking away your freedom, your dignity, your belief that you're safe in this world. If you're watching this from wherever you are, and I hope you'll take a moment to tell me in the comments where that might be, I want you to know that what I'm about to share with you isn't easy to tell. It surely isn't easy to remember, but I'm telling it anyway because somewhere out there, someone needs to know that you can survive the unthinkable, that you can rebuild your life after it's been shattered, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is speak the truth about what happened to you, no matter how painful that truth might be. Before we go any further, if this story helps you recognize something in your own life, or gives you courage to reach out for help, or simply reminds you that you're not alone in whatever darkness you might be facing, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Share it with others who might need to hear it. Every voice raised in truth makes the world a little safer, and every story told makes it a little easier for the next person to find the strength to speak their own truth. I want to take you back to a time when I thought I knew what love looked like, when I believed that trust was something solid and reliable, when I never imagined that the man I'd been planning to marry could become my captor, my tormentor, the person who would teach me that sometimes survival means more than just staying alive. Sometimes it means finding the strength to escape from someone who claims to love you, but whose love has become a cage. The scars from those 2 days aren't visible anymore. My wrists healed, my bruises faded. The cut on my forehead left only the faintest line that you'd have to know to look for. But the scars on my soul, the invisible wounds that changed how I move through the world, how I trust, how I love, those are still with me, 37 years later. Not as raw pain anymore, but as hard-won wisdom about the difference between love that protects and love that possesses, between care that nurtures and care that controls. But before I tell you about those 2 days in that locked room, about the man I thought I knew turning into someone I didn't recognize, about the terror and helplessness and desperate fight for survival, I need to tell you about how it started. About the relationship that seemed so right, so safe, so full of promise, that I never saw the warning signs that were there from the beginning. About the man who wooed me with kindness and attention and promises of forever, who made me feel treasured and protected and loved in ways I'd never experienced before. The control doesn't usually announce itself with dramatic gestures or obvious threats. Instead, it seeps into your life like water through a crack in the foundation, so gradually that you don't notice the damage until the whole structure starts to crumble. It whispers that its possessiveness is proof of love, that its jealousy is evidence of devotion, that its need to know where you are every moment of every day is just because it cares so much about your safety. The man who would eventually lock me in that room for 2 days didn't start out as a monster. He started out as David Warren, a 42-year-old divorced contractor who fixed my leaky roof in the spring of 1986 and stayed to fix what I thought was my lonely heart. He was handsome in a rugged way, with calloused hands and kind eyes and a slow smile that made me feel like the most beautiful woman in the world when he turned it in my direction. I was 38 then, recently divorced myself after 15 years of marriage to a man who'd left me for his secretary. I was raising my teenage daughter alone, working double shifts at the hospital as a nurse, trying to rebuild a life that had been knocked off its foundation when my husband walked out. I wasn't looking for love, honestly. I was too tired and too busy and too hurt to even consider opening my heart again. But David was persistent in the gentlest way. He'd find reasons to check on his work, to make sure the roof was holding up properly. He'd bring coffee for both of us and sit on my front porch, telling me about his day, asking about mine, making me laugh with stories about the crazy things he'd encountered on various job sites. He had a way of making ordinary conversations feel special, of making me feel seen and valued, and interesting in ways I'd forgotten I could feel. "You've got the most beautiful smile," he told me one evening, as we sat watching the sunset from those same porch steps where I'm sitting now. "I've been thinking about it all day, wondering if I could say something to make you smile just like that again." It was exactly the kind of attention I'd been starving for without even realizing it. After years of feeling invisible to my ex-husband, years of being taken for granted and ultimately discarded, David's focused interest in me felt like coming back to life. He made me feel desirable again, worthy of love again, like maybe the best parts of my life weren't behind me after all. The courtship, because that's what it felt like, an old-fashioned courtship full of flowers and dinner dates and long conversations that lasted until dawn, went on for 6 months. David was everything my ex-husband hadn't been: attentive, romantic, interested in my thoughts and feelings, eager to be part of my life and my daughter's life. He came to her soccer games, helped her with her homework, treated her with the kind of patient kindness that made me think he'd be a wonderful stepfather. "He's good for you, Mom," Sarah told me one night after David had helped her practice for her driving test. "I haven't seen you this happy since, well, maybe ever." "He makes you laugh again." And he did make me laugh. He made me feel alive and hopeful and beautiful. He made me believe in second chances and new beginnings and the possibility that love could be better the second time around, built on the foundation of hard-won wisdom rather than youthful naivety. But there were moments, even during those honeymoon months, when something would flicker across David's face that made me feel uneasy. A flash of anger when I mentioned having lunch with a female coworker, a tightness around his eyes when I talked about my ex-husband, even in the context of coordinating Sarah's visits, a way of asking questions about my day that felt less like interest and more like interrogation, though I told myself I was being oversensitive, reading too much into innocent curiosity. "You seem tired," he'd say, when I'd had a particularly long shift at the hospital. "Maybe you should think about cutting back your hours. I make good money. I could take care of you. You wouldn't have to work so hard." At the time, it sounded like love, like a man who wanted to protect me from the exhaustion and stress that had become my daily reality. I didn't recognize it as the first step in a campaign to isolate me, to make me financially dependent, to create a situation where leaving would become increasingly difficult. The evening light is starting to fade now, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that make even difficult memories feel softer around the edges. Soon I'll go inside to my safe house, to my peaceful evening routine, to my restful sleep, untroubled by the fear that someone might hurt me while I'm unconscious and vulnerable. But first, I want to tell you about the man who taught me that love and terror can exist in the same heart, that protection and possession are separated by the thinnest of lines, and that sometimes the cage is built so carefully, so lovingly, that you don't realize you're trapped until the door slams shut and you hear the key turn in the lock. Let me tell you about David Warren and how he convinced me that his love was the answer to all my problems, right up until the moment that love became the biggest problem I'd ever faced. To understand how completely David was able to control me, how thoroughly he was able to isolate me before finally trapping me in that room, you have to understand what my life looked like when he entered it. You have to know about the woman I was in 1986. Vulnerable, exhausted, desperate for someone to share the burdens I'd been carrying alone for too long. I'd been divorced for 2 years by then, after discovering that my husband of 15 years had been having an affair with his 24-year-old secretary for most of our marriage. The divorce had been messy and expensive, leaving me with a mortgage I could barely afford and custody of Sarah, who was 15 and struggling with her own anger about her father's betrayal and abandonment. I was working 12-hour shifts at Methodist Hospital, sometimes picking up extra shifts on my days off just to keep us afloat financially. I'd come home exhausted, help Sarah with homework, throw together something resembling dinner, and fall into bed, only to do it all again the next day. I loved nursing. I'd always loved caring for people, helping them through their worst moments. But the physical and emotional demands of the job, combined with single parenthood, had worn me down to almost nothing. That's the state I was in when David first knocked on my door in March of 1986, clipboard in hand, explaining that he'd noticed some loose shingles on my roof and wanted to give me an estimate for repairs before they caused more serious damage. "Storm season's coming," he said, his voice warm with what seemed like genuine concern. "You don't want water getting into your walls. Could cause thousands of dollars in damage if you let it go." He was tall and solid-looking, with graying hair at his temples and eyes the color of summer sky. He wore work clothes that were clean but well-used, and he had the kind of confident posture that comes from knowing how to fix things, how to solve problems that other people found overwhelming. The estimate he gave me was fair. I called around to check, and he offered to let me pay in installments rather than requiring the full amount up front. When I explained that money was tight, that I was a single mother trying to make ends meet, he nodded with understanding that didn't feel like pity. "I've got a daughter too," he said. "Grown now, but I remember those years when it felt like everything needed fixing at once and there was never enough money to fix it all. We'll work something out." The roof repair took 3 days, and by the end of it, David had become a regular presence in our lives. He'd arrive early in the morning with coffee and donuts, making sure Sarah had something more substantial than cereal for breakfast before school. He'd take breaks to help her with algebra homework that had been frustrating us both for weeks. He'd insist on checking all the other small things around the house that needed attention: loose cabinet hinges, a sticky window lock, the garbage disposal that had been making ominous grinding noises. "Just while I'm here anyway," he'd say, when I protested that I couldn't afford to pay him for all the extra work. "Doesn't make sense to let these little problems turn into big, expensive problems." Sarah liked him immediately, which surprised me. She'd been suspicious of any man who showed interest in me since the divorce, protective in the way that children become when they've watched one parent hurt the other. But David had a way with teenagers. He listened to her complaints about teachers and friends without trying to fix everything. He remembered details about her life that even I sometimes forgot in my exhaustion, and he treated her like her opinions mattered. "He's not like Dad," she told me one evening after David had stayed for dinner and helped clean up afterward. "Dad always acted like spending time with us was something he had to do. David acts like he wants to be here." And he did seem to want to be there. After the roof was finished, he found reasons to stop by, to check on his work, to drop off vegetables from his garden, to ask if I needed help with anything around the house. The visits gradually became longer, more frequent, more central to the rhythm of our daily lives. "I know you're probably too tired to cook after a 12-hour shift," he'd say, showing up at my door with takeout from the Chinese restaurant downtown. "Thought maybe you and Sarah could use a break from kitchen duty." It was exactly the kind of thoughtfulness I'd been missing for years. My ex-husband had never been considerate about my work schedule, never offered to help with household tasks, never seemed to notice when I was overwhelmed or exhausted. David noticed everything: when I was stressed about bills, when Sarah was having trouble at school, when I was picking up too many extra shifts and wearing myself thin. "You don't have to carry everything alone," he told me one evening as we sat on the front porch after Sarah had gone to bed. "You've been so strong for so long, but everyone needs someone to lean on sometimes." The first time he kissed me, 6 weeks after we'd met, it felt like coming home. We were standing in my kitchen after he'd helped me hang new curtains, and he reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear with fingers that were gentle, despite their calluses. "I've been wanting to do this since the day I met you," he said softly. And when his lips touched mine, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Desired. Treasured. Like I was someone worth fighting for. The physical relationship developed slowly, carefully, with David always checking to make sure I was comfortable, always making me feel like my needs and boundaries mattered. After years of feeling invisible and unwanted in my marriage, his attention was intoxicating. He made me feel beautiful at 38, made me believe that my stretch marks and crow's feet and tired eyes were somehow attractive to him. "You're perfect," he'd whisper as we lay together in my bedroom, his hands tracing patterns on my skin like he was memorizing every inch of me. "Absolutely perfect. I can't believe how lucky I am." By late summer, we were talking about marriage. David had proposed spending more time at my house, contributing to expenses, sharing the responsibilities of daily life. It made practical sense. He was paying rent on an apartment across town while spending most of his time at our place anyway. And it felt like a natural progression of our relationship. "I want to take care of you," he said one evening as we planned his move-in. "You've been taking care of everyone else for so long. Let me be the one who takes care of you for a change." Sarah was enthusiastic about the arrangement. She'd grown attached to David, and having him around made our house feel more stable, more secure. He helped with her driving practice, attended her soccer games, took over many of the traditionally masculine household tasks that I'd been struggling to manage alone. "It's like having a real family again," she said, and I knew exactly what she meant. For the first time since the divorce, our house felt like a home, instead of just a place where two exhausted people collapsed at the end of each day. David moved in September, and for the first few months everything seemed perfect. Better than perfect, actually. He was more attentive, more helpful, more romantic than he'd been during our courtship. He'd surprise me with flowers, cook elaborate dinners when I had to work late, run bubble baths for me when I came home stressed and tired. But there were small changes that I noticed, but didn't quite know how to interpret. He started asking more detailed questions about my shifts. Not just when I'd be home, but which patients I'd been assigned, which doctors I'd worked with, whether there had been any male nurses or orderlies on the unit. "Just want to know about your day," he'd say when I questioned the level of detail he seemed to need. "I'm interested in your work, in the people you spend time with. Is that wrong?" He began expressing concerns about Sarah's activities, whether her friends were good influences, whether she really needed to stay after school for so many different clubs and activities, whether some of her teachers might be too friendly with their students. "I'm just trying to look out for her," he'd explain, when I pointed out that she'd been involved in these same activities for years without any problems. "There are a lot of dangerous people out there, Mary. A lot of men who see a pretty teenage girl and get the wrong ideas." The changes were gradual enough that I told myself I was overreacting, that David was just being protective because he cared about us. He'd never been married to someone with a teenage daughter before. Maybe he was just adjusting to the responsibilities, learning how to be part of a family unit that had been functioning on its own for years. But looking back now, I can see that those first few months were when David was testing boundaries, seeing how much control I'd accept in the name of love and protection. He was studying our routines, our relationships, our support systems, looking for weaknesses he could exploit and dependencies he could create. He was preparing for the moment when love would become possession, when care would become control, when the man who'd seemed like my salvation would reveal himself to be my captor. I just didn't know it yet. The shift from loving protection to suffocating control happened so gradually that I didn't recognize it until I was already caught in David's web. It started with suggestions that seemed reasonable, concerns that felt justified, requests that appeared to come from a place of genuine care for my well-being and safety. The first real red flag came about 4 months after David moved in. During the Christmas season of 1986, I'd been working extra shifts to help pay for Sarah's gifts and to catch up on some bills that had gotten behind while I was adjusting to having another person's expenses added to our household budget. David had been understanding about the long hours at first, even supportive, encouraging me to take advantage of the holiday pay differential. But as Christmas approached and my schedule remained hectic, his understanding began to shift into something that felt more like resentment. "I hardly see you anymore," he said one evening when I came home from a particularly brutal 14-hour shift. "It's like you're avoiding spending time at home." I was exhausted, my feet aching, my back sore from lifting patients and being on my feet all day. The last thing I wanted was to have a serious conversation about our relationship, but David seemed determined to discuss what he saw as a problem with my priorities. "I'm not avoiding anything," I said, sitting down heavily on the couch and pulling off my nursing shoes. "I'm working. We need the money, especially with Christmas coming up." "Do we, though?" David asked, settling beside me with an expression that seemed both caring and concerned. "I mean, I'm contributing to the household expenses now. Maybe you don't need to work quite so much. Maybe you could cut back a little, spend more time at home, focus more on us." There was nothing obviously wrong with what he was saying. Many couples had conversations about work-life balance, about how to prioritize time together, about managing financial pressures without sacrificing their relationship. But something about the way David framed it made me feel defensive in ways I couldn't quite articulate. "This is what I do," I said carefully. "I'm a nurse. I've been supporting myself and Sarah for years. I can't just cut back because it's more convenient for our social life." "I'm not asking you to quit," David said, his voice taking on the patient tone he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. "I'm just saying that maybe you don't need to be quite so dedicated to your job. Maybe your family should come first sometimes." The word family hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I wasn't ready to examine. David had been hinting more frequently about marriage, about making our arrangement permanent, about becoming Sarah's official stepfather. But something about the way he said family in this context felt like he was claiming ownership rather than expressing commitment. "Sarah and I are my family," I said quietly, "and my job is how I take care of my family." David's expression shifted then, just for a moment, and I saw something in his eyes that made my stomach tighten with unease. It was gone so quickly I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, but for just an instant, he'd looked angry, in a way that felt dangerous rather than hurt. "Of course," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. I just want to make sure you're not burning yourself out. You matter to me, Mary. Your health matters. Your happiness matters." The conversation ended there, but it marked the beginning of a pattern that would become increasingly familiar over the next few months. David would express concerns about my work schedule, my relationships with coworkers, my friendships outside our household. He'd frame these concerns in language of love and protection, but underneath I began to sense something that felt more like possession than care. He started asking detailed questions about my shifts, not just when I'd be home, but which patients I'd been assigned, which doctors I'd worked with, whether there had been any social interactions that went beyond strictly professional relationships. "Dr. Peterson seems to seek you out a lot," he observed one evening after I'd mentioned that the resident had asked for my assistance with a difficult case. "Is that normal? For doctors to request specific nurses?" "It happens," I said, though I was beginning to feel like I was defending myself against accusations that hadn't been explicitly made. "When you've been on a unit for as long as I have, you develop working relationships with the medical staff. They know what you're capable of." "I'm sure that's all it is," David said, but his tone suggested he thought it might be something more. "I just worry that some of these doctors might not understand that you're in a committed relationship, might get the wrong idea about your availability." Similar conversations began happening about other aspects of my life. When I mentioned having lunch with my friend Jennifer, David would ask detailed questions about what we'd discussed, whether she'd ask about our relationship, whether she'd made any comments that suggested she thought David wasn't good for me. "I'm not trying to be controlling," he'd say, when I pointed out that his questions felt invasive. "I just want to make sure people are being respectful of our relationship. Some of your friends seem to think they know what's best for you better than you do." The isolation was so gradual that I didn't recognize it as isolation. David never forbade me from seeing friends or coworkers socially. He was too smart for such obvious controlling behavior. Instead, he made each social interaction feel complicated, fraught with potential problems that needed to be discussed and analyzed and worried about until it seemed easier to just stay home. "Linda seems nice," he'd say after meeting one of my nursing colleagues at a hospital function. "But did you notice how she kept making little digs about men in general? She seems like she might be one of those women who thinks all relationships are inherently problematic. You might want to be careful about how much relationship advice you take from someone like that." He was subtle about it, but effective. Within 6 months of moving in, my social circle had shrunk considerably. I was spending almost all my free time at home with David and Sarah, and David had positioned himself as my primary source of emotional support and social interaction. The financial control started around the same time. David suggested that it would be more efficient if we combined our resources, if he took over managing the household budget while I focused on my demanding work schedule. "You're already exhausted when you get home," he pointed out. "Why add the stress of paying bills and balancing checkbooks to everything else you're dealing with? Let me handle the financial stuff. I'm good with numbers, and I'm home more than you are anyway." It seemed practical, even considerate. David was indeed home more than I was. His contracting work gave him more flexible hours than my hospital schedule, and I was indeed exhausted by the time I got home most days. Having someone else handle the mundane tasks of household management felt like a gift, rather than a loss of independence. But once David was managing our finances, I began to lose track of exactly how much money we had, how much I was contributing versus how much he was contributing, how much we were spending on various expenses. When I'd ask questions about our budget, David would provide answers that seemed reasonable but somehow never gave me the complete picture I was looking for. "Don't worry about it," he'd say when I expressed concern about whether we could afford something. "I've got it handled." That's what partners do, they handle things for each other. The word partners felt both comforting and ominous. On one hand, it suggested equality, shared responsibility, mutual support. On the other hand, David seemed to interpret partnership as meaning that he made decisions and I trusted them, rather than us making decisions together. The most troubling change was in how David related to Sarah. During our courtship and the early months of living together, he'd been wonderful with her, patient, supportive, interested in her activities and opinions. But as his control over me increased, his attitude toward her began to shift as well. He started expressing concerns about her social life that seemed disproportionate to any actual problems. He questioned whether her friends were good influences, whether her teachers were appropriate in their interactions with students, whether her activities were taking up too much time and attention that should be focused on family. "I think Sarah's getting a little too independent," he said, one evening after she'd asked permission to go to a movie with friends. "She's only 16. She shouldn't be so eager to spend time away from home." "She's always been independent," I replied, feeling defensive on my daughter's behalf. "That's a good thing. It means she's confident and self-reliant." "Or it means she doesn't value family time," David countered. "Kids her age need structure, supervision. They need to know that family comes first, not social activities with friends we barely know." The conversations about Sarah became increasingly frequent and increasingly critical. David found fault with her attitude, her choices, her friends, her activities. He began suggesting that I was too permissive, that Sarah needed more discipline, that her independence was actually a sign of disrespect for family authority. "You're her mother," he'd say when I resisted his suggestions for stricter rules and more limitations on Sarah's freedom. "But you're also a woman who's been on her own for a long time. Maybe you're not the best judge of what a teenage girl needs from a father figure." The word father was another loaded term. David had never officially adopted Sarah, never married me, never been given any legal authority over my daughter. But he was increasingly acting as though he had parental rights, as though his opinions about Sarah's upbringing should carry the same weight as mine. I found myself caught between my loyalty to Sarah and my desire to maintain peace in my relationship with David. When conflicts arose, which they did, with increasing frequency, I felt pressure to choose sides, to decide whether supporting my daughter or supporting my partner was more important for our family's stability. It was an impossible position, and David seemed to recognize that the divided loyalty made me more malleable, more likely to compromise in ways that gradually eroded my autonomy and authority in my own household. By the spring of 1987, a year after David had moved in, I was living a life that looked successful from the outside, but felt increasingly constrained from the inside. I was in a relationship with a man who claimed to love me, but seemed to need to control every aspect of my existence. I was parenting a daughter who was becoming more distant and resentful as David's influence in our home grew stronger. Most troubling of all, I was beginning to lose confidence in my own judgment, my own instincts, my own ability to make decisions about my life and my daughter's life. David had become so skilled at questioning my choices, so effective at presenting his controlling behavior as care and protection, that I was starting to wonder if maybe he was right. Maybe I was too independent, too stubborn, too unwilling to accept help and guidance from someone who loved me. The psychological groundwork for what would happen in that locked room was being laid, one subtle manipulation at a time, one small surrender of autonomy after another, one compromise of my boundaries and beliefs after the next. I was being prepared for captivity without even realizing it was happening. The weekend that changed everything started like so many others, with a fight that seemed to come out of nowhere but had probably been building for months. It was Friday evening, May 15, 1987, and I'd just gotten home from a particularly difficult shift at the hospital. We'd lost a patient that day, a woman not much older than me, who'd been fighting cancer for 2 years, and I was emotionally drained, in the way that sometimes happens when your job requires you to watch people suffer and die despite everyone's best efforts to save them. Sarah was spending the weekend at her father's house, one of his rare exercises of his visitation rights, so it was just David and me in the house. I'd been looking forward to a quiet evening, maybe ordering pizza and watching a movie, processing the day's grief in the comfort of my own home with someone who understood the demands of my work. But David had other plans. "We need to talk," he said as soon as I walked through the door, his tone serious in a way that immediately put me on edge. "About us. About where this relationship is going. About whether you're really committed to making this work." I was tired, sad, and emotionally vulnerable from the day I'd had. The last thing I wanted was a heavy conversation about our relationship, especially one that seemed to start with the assumption that I wasn't sufficiently committed to it. "Can we do this tomorrow?" I asked, setting down my purse and heading toward the kitchen to pour myself a glass of wine. "It's been a really hard day, and I just want to decompress for a while." "No," David said, following me into the kitchen, his voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. "We can't do this tomorrow. We've been putting this conversation off for months, and I'm tired of pretending everything is fine when it's not." I turned to look at him, really look at him, and what I saw in his face made my blood run cold. This wasn't the caring, protective man I'd fallen in love with. This was someone harder, angrier, more dangerous than I'd ever seen him before. "What are you talking about?" I asked carefully, my hand tightening around the wine glass. "What's not fine?" "You," David said, moving closer in a way that felt threatening rather than intimate. "Your attitude, your priorities, the way you've been pulling away from me, from us, from the family we're trying to build together." The accusations came pouring out then. Months of resentments and suspicions that David had apparently been cataloging without ever discussing them with me. He accused me of being more committed to my job than to our relationship. He accused me of encouraging Sarah's disrespect for his authority. He accused me of maintaining inappropriate relationships with male co-workers. He accused me of planning to leave him, of using him for financial stability while keeping one foot out the door. "That's not true," I said, backing away from him as his voice grew louder and his gestures more aggressive. "None of that is true. I love you, David. I've been trying to make this work, trying to build a life with you." "Bullshit," he spat, and the venom in his voice made me flinch. "You've been going through the motions while keeping yourself emotionally unavailable. You think I don't see it? The way you shut down when I try to get close to you? The way you make decisions about Sarah without consulting me? The way you flirt with that doctor at work?" "I don't flirt with anyone at work," I said, my own anger starting to rise despite my fear. "Dr. Peterson is a colleague. We have a professional relationship, nothing more." "Professional?" David repeated mockingly. "Is that what you call it when you stay late to help him with cases? When you laugh at his jokes? When you light up whenever someone mentions his name?" The jealousy was so irrational, so disconnected from reality, that I finally understood I was dealing with someone whose perception of our relationship bore no resemblance to the actual relationship we'd been living. David had constructed an elaborate fantasy in which I was betraying him in dozens of ways that existed only in his imagination. "You're being ridiculous," I said, and the moment the words left my mouth, I knew I'd made a mistake. David's face went completely still, and when he spoke again, his voice was deadly quiet. "Ridiculous?" he said. "I'm being ridiculous for caring about our relationship, for wanting honesty from the woman I love, for expecting loyalty from the woman I've been supporting and protecting for over a year?" "Supporting and protecting?" I repeated, my own voice rising now. "David, I've been supporting myself for years. I was fine before you came along, and I'll be fine." I never got to finish the sentence. David moved faster than I would have thought possible, crossing the kitchen in 2 quick steps and grabbing my wrist with enough force to make me drop the wine glass. It shattered on the floor, red wine spreading across the white linoleum like blood. "You'll be fine what?" David demanded, his grip on my wrist so tight I could feel the bones grinding together. "You'll be fine without me? Is that what you were going to say?" "You're hurting me," I said, trying to pull away from him, but his grip only tightened. "I'm hurting you." David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You have no idea what hurt looks like, but you're going to learn." What happened next was like something out of a nightmare. David dragged me through the house by my wrist, ignoring my protests and struggles, his face set in an expression of grim determination that terrified me more than his anger had. He pulled me up the stairs to the spare bedroom at the end of the hall, the room we'd been using for storage since he moved in. "David, stop," I begged, panic rising in my throat as he pushed me through the doorway. "What are you doing? Talk to me. Whatever's wrong, we can work it out." "We tried talking," David said, his voice eerily calm now. "You're not interested in talking. You're not interested in working anything out. So we're going to try something different." He shoved me hard enough that I stumbled and fell onto the bare mattress that had been stored in the corner of the room. Before I could get back to my feet, he was out the door, and I heard the distinctive sound of a key turning in a lock I hadn't even known existed. "David," I called, rushing to the door and trying the handle. It wouldn't turn. "David, open this door. This is insane. You can't lock me in here. I can do whatever I need to do." His voice came through the door, muffled but clear. "To protect our relationship. To make you understand how much you need me. To show you what life would be like if you lost me." I pounded on the door, screaming for him to let me out, but his footsteps were already moving away down the hall. Within minutes, the house was completely quiet, except for the sound of my own sobbing and the frantic beating of my heart. The room was small and windowless, with just the mattress, some boxes of Christmas decorations, and an old lamp that David had apparently left plugged in. There was no phone, no way to communicate with the outside world, no way to call for help. I was trapped, completely at David's mercy, in a room in my own house. The first few hours were the worst. I alternated between pounding on the door and screaming for help, then collapsing on the mattress in exhausted terror, then getting up to pound and scream again. I couldn't believe this was happening. Couldn't believe that the man I'd trusted with my heart and my home and my daughter's well-being had revealed himself to be capable of such calculated cruelty. As night fell and the house grew darker and quieter, the psychological torture began in earnest. David would come to the door periodically, sometimes to slide a glass of water or a piece of bread underneath, sometimes just to talk through the wood, explaining why this was necessary, why I'd brought this on myself, why my freedom depended on my willingness to acknowledge my mistakes and commit to being a better partner. "This is what life without me looks like," he said during one of his visits. "Isolated, helpless, dependent on the kindness of others for your basic needs. Is this what you want, Mary? Is this the independence you're so eager to get back to?" The second day was worse than the first. By then, the reality of my situation had fully sunk in. I was completely at David's mercy, trapped in a room with no way to escape, no way to contact anyone for help, no way to even know if anyone was looking for me. Sarah was at her father's house for the weekend, so she wouldn't miss me until Sunday evening at the earliest. I wasn't scheduled to work again until Monday, so my absence wouldn't be noticed at the hospital until then. David had chosen his timing perfectly. He had at least 48 hours before anyone would even realize I was missing, let alone trace my disappearance back to him. The physical discomfort was bad enough. The hard mattress, the increasingly urgent need for a bathroom that David only allowed me to use under his supervision, the hunger that gnawed at my stomach as he provided just enough food and water to keep me functional but not comfortable. But the psychological torture was devastating. David had found the perfect weapon against me. My own home turned into a prison. My own trust and love turned into chains that bound me more effectively than any physical restraints ever could. "All you have to do is admit that you've been taking me for granted," he said through the door on Saturday evening. "Admit that you've been prioritizing everything else over our relationship. Promise me that things will be different when I let you out. Promise me that you'll be the partner I deserve, and this can all be over." I was exhausted, terrified, and beginning to lose hope that I would ever get out of that room alive. The man I'd thought I loved had revealed himself to be a monster, and I was completely at his mercy, with no idea how far he was willing to go to maintain control over me. But even in my terror, even in my desperation, something inside me refused to give him what he wanted. Some part of me understood that surrendering to his demands wouldn't earn my freedom. It would only confirm his belief that fear and isolation were effective tools for controlling me.
"I won't do it," I whispered to the darkness. "I won't let you break me." It was the first moment in 48 hours that I felt like myself again. Terrified, trapped, but still myself. Still Mary, not the broken, submissive woman David was trying to create through fear and isolation. I had no idea how I was going to get out of that room, but I knew I wasn't going to let David remake me into someone who would never try. The worst part of being trapped in that room wasn't the physical discomfort, though that was real enough. It wasn't the hunger, though David kept me on the edge of starvation with just enough food to keep me conscious but weak. It wasn't even the growing desperation about whether anyone would find me before David decided I'd learned my lesson, or before he escalated to something even more dangerous. The worst part was the psychological warfare David waged against me during those 2 days. The systematic attempt to break down my sense of self, my confidence in my own perceptions, my belief that I deserved better than what he was doing to me. He would come to the door at irregular intervals, sometimes to provide the minimal food and water that kept me alive, sometimes just to talk. Those conversations were the most insidious form of torture I'd ever experienced, worse than any physical violence, because they were designed to make me complicit in my own destruction. "I don't want to hurt you, Mary," he'd say, his voice soft and reasonable through the wooden door. "This isn't about punishment. This is about helping you understand what you stand to lose if you keep pushing me away. This is about showing you how much you need me, how lost you'd be without me." In the beginning, I'd respond with anger, shouting back that he was insane, that what he was doing was kidnapping, that I'd call the police the moment I got out of that room. But David was patient with my rage, treating it like a child's tantrum that he needed to wait out, rather than a legitimate response to being imprisoned in my own home. "You're upset," he'd say calmly. "I understand that. Change is always difficult, especially when it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves. But once you've had time to really think about our relationship, about the patterns that brought us to this point, you'll see that I'm trying to help you." The gaslighting was relentless and sophisticated. David never acknowledged that locking me in a room was wrong. Instead, he reframed it as a necessary intervention, like staging an intervention for someone with an addiction. According to his narrative, I was addicted to independence, to the illusion that I didn't need him, to the fantasy that I could maintain our relationship while holding back parts of myself. "You've been emotionally unavailable for months," he explained during one of his visits, his voice patient and therapeutic, like he was counseling me through a difficult realization. "Every time I try to get closer to you, you find reasons to pull away. Every time I express legitimate concerns about our relationship, you shut down the conversation. This is just forcing you to sit with your feelings instead of running away from them." The isolation gave his words a power they never would have had in normal circumstances. Trapped in that small, dark room with no one to talk to except David, no external perspective to help me maintain my grip on reality, I began to doubt my own memories and perceptions in ways that terrified me almost as much as the physical captivity itself. Had I been pulling away from him? Looking back on the past few months, I could remember times when I'd felt overwhelmed by his intensity, when I'd needed space to think and breathe and remember who I was outside of our relationship. David reframed this natural need for autonomy as evidence of my inability to commit, my fear of genuine intimacy, my selfishness in prioritizing my own comfort over his emotional needs. "All I've ever wanted was to love you completely," he said during one particularly devastating conversation. "To build a life together where we don't have secrets, where we don't hold back parts of ourselves, where we can trust each other completely. But you've been fighting that from the beginning, haven't you? You've been keeping one foot out the door, just in case you decide I'm not worth the risk." The terrible thing was that some of what he said resonated with truths I'd been trying not to examine. I had been holding back parts of myself. I had been maintaining a level of independence that sometimes felt like emotional distance. I had been questioning whether our relationship was healthy, whether David's need for control was something I could live with long term. But in the isolation of that room, cut off from friends and family and any external perspective that might have validated my concerns, David's interpretation of my behavior began to seem more plausible than my own. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe my resistance to his control was actually resistance to intimacy. Maybe my discomfort with his jealousy was actually guilt about my own inappropriate behavior. I know you've been thinking about leaving me, David said on the second day, and the quiet certainty in his voice made my blood run cold. I know you've been planning it probably for months, finding excuses to work extra shifts so you can save money, encouraging Sarah to be disrespectful to me so I'll get frustrated and leave on my own, flirting with that doctor so you'll have somewhere to go when you finally work up the courage to kick me out. None of that was true, but David presented it with such conviction that I found myself wondering if maybe my subconscious had been planning an escape that my conscious mind hadn't acknowledged. Maybe the unease I'd been feeling about our relationship was actually my own guilt about my disloyalty, my inability to commit fully to the man who'd been nothing but loving and supportive. I would never cheat on you, I said through the door, my voice small and uncertain. David, you know I would never. Do I? He interrupted. Do I know that? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been setting up your exit strategy for months. It looks like you've been using me for financial security while keeping your options open for something better. The accusation was so unfair, so divorced from the reality of our relationship, that it should have been easy to dismiss. But the psychological pressure of being trapped, isolated, completely dependent on David for my basic survival made it impossible to maintain confidence in my own version of events. By the second evening, I was beginning to crack under the weight of David's relentless psychological assault. The combination of fear, isolation, hunger, and constant manipulation was wearing down my resistance in ways I hadn't thought possible. I started to wonder if maybe he was right. Maybe I had been a bad partner. Maybe I did deserve this treatment as a wake-up call about my own behavior. I love you so much, Mary, David said during what felt like our 100th conversation through that locked door. I love you enough to do whatever it takes to save our relationship, even when it's hard for both of us, even when it means forcing you to confront things about yourself that you don't want to see. The twisted logic was insidious. David was reframing his abuse as love, his control as care, his cruelty as a necessary intervention designed to help me become a better person. And in my weakened, isolated state, cut off from any external perspective that might have reminded me that healthy love doesn't require imprisonment, I was beginning to believe him. What do you want from me? I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I want you to stop fighting me, David replied immediately, as if he'd been waiting for exactly this moment of surrender. I want you to stop treating our relationship like it's temporary, like you're just marking time until something better comes along. I want you to commit to us completely. No more emotional walls, no more divided loyalties, no more prioritizing your independence over our future together. As he spoke, I could hear the hunger in his voice, the satisfaction of someone who sensed victory within reach. David had been working toward this moment from the beginning, not just the past 2 days in the locked room, but the entire year and a half of our relationship. He'd been systematically breaking down my resistance, my independence, my sense of self, so that when he finally trapped me physically, I'd be psychologically prepared to accept his version of reality over my own. If I agree, I said carefully, if I promise to try harder, to be more committed, will you let me out of here? Oh, Mary, David said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. This isn't about promises. This is about transformation. This is about you finally understanding what it means to truly surrender to love. Promises can be broken, but real change that lasts forever. The words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. David wasn't planning to let me out just because I said the right words or made the right promises. He was planning to keep me trapped until he was satisfied that I'd been fundamentally altered, that the independent woman he'd fallen in love with had been completely replaced by someone more manageable, more controllable, more willing to accept his authority over every aspect of her life. That's when I understood that this wasn't going to end with my capitulation. This was going to end with my complete psychological destruction, or with my escape, or with my death. David had moved beyond wanting to control me. He wanted to recreate me entirely, to build a new Mary who would never question his authority, never prioritize her own needs, never imagine a life outside his control. But even as that terrifying realization settled over me, I felt something else stirring in the darkness of that room. Not hope exactly, but something harder and more determined. Rage. Not the hot, explosive anger I'd felt in the beginning, but a cold, focused fury at what David was trying to do to me, to my mind, to my very sense of who I was. He could lock me in this room, he could starve me and isolate me and wage psychological warfare against my sanity, but he could not make me surrender the core of who I was, the essential Mary that existed independent of his love or approval or control. I was going to get out of that room, and when I did, I was going to make sure David Warren never had the opportunity to trap another woman the way he'd trapped me. The only question was, how? My escape came in the form of a 14-year-old girl with more courage than most adults I've known. Sarah had been scheduled to stay at her father's house through Sunday evening, but something about my absence from our usual Saturday phone call had worried her enough that she convinced him to bring her home early Sunday afternoon to check on me. I'd been trapped in that room for almost 48 hours when I heard her voice calling for me from downstairs. Mom? Mom, are you here? Your car's in the driveway, but you're not answering. I had never heard anything more beautiful in my life. I started screaming immediately, pounding on the door with both fists, shouting her name over and over until my throat was raw. Sarah! Sarah, I'm up here. I'm locked in the spare room. Help me! The house went quiet for a moment, and I could hear David's voice, smooth and calm, explaining to my daughter that I was having some kind of breakdown, that I'd locked myself in the room and refused to come out, that he'd been trying to talk me through it, but I wasn't being rational. She's been under a lot of stress at work, I heard him say, his voice carrying that same reasonable tone he'd been using to gaslight me for 2 days. Sometimes people just need space to work through their problems. She asked me not to bother her, said she needed time alone to think. But Sarah knew me better than David had counted on. She knew I would never voluntarily lock myself away from her, especially not without explaining what was happening. She knew the sound of genuine terror in my voice, and she knew the difference between someone choosing isolation and someone being forced into it. Mom, are you okay? She called, and I could hear her footsteps on the stairs, coming closer despite David's protests. No, baby, I'm not okay, I called back, my voice breaking with relief and desperation. David locked me in here. I can't get out. The door is locked from the outside. That's not true, David said quickly, but there was panic in his voice now, the first crack in his controlled demeanor I'd heard since this nightmare began. Sarah, your mother is confused. She's been saying all kinds of things that don't make sense. But Sarah was already at the door, trying the handle, confirming what I'd told her. Mom, here's a key in the lock, she said, and I heard the beautiful sound of metal turning. I'm getting you out. The door opened, and I stumbled out into the hallway, blinking in the sudden light, my legs weak from 2 days of minimal food and movement. Sarah caught me as I nearly fell, her young arms surprisingly strong as she supported my weight. Oh my God, Mom, she whispered, taking in my appearance, my tangled hair, my wrinkled clothes, the bruises on my wrists where David had grabbed me, the wild look in my eyes that probably made me barely recognizable as the competent professional woman she'd known all her life. David was standing at the top of the stairs, and the expression on his face was something I'll never forget. Not anger, not fear, but calculation. He was trying to decide what to do now that his carefully constructed narrative had fallen apart, now that there was a witness who couldn't be manipulated or controlled. Sarah, you don't understand, he said, taking a step toward us. Your mother has been having some kind of psychological episode. I was trying to protect her, to keep her safe until I could get professional help. But Sarah wasn't buying it. My smart, brave daughter looked David straight in the eye and said, "Get away from us, get away from my mother, and get out of our house." The next few hours were a blur of police reports and medical examinations and phone calls to friends who came to stay with us while David was arrested and charged with unlawful imprisonment and domestic violence. The physical evidence was clear: the locked room, my injuries, my dehydrated and malnourished state, but it was Sarah's testimony that sealed the case. Her clear, unwavering account of finding me trapped and David's immediate attempts to lie about what had happened. The legal process that followed was long and emotionally draining, but ultimately successful. David was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison, though he served only 3. More importantly, for my immediate safety, he was required to stay away from me and Sarah as a condition of his parole. But the real battle wasn't in the courtroom. It was in my own mind, where David's psychological manipulation had done damage that would take years to fully heal. In the weeks immediately following my escape, I experienced what my therapist later explained was a common response to psychological trauma. I couldn't trust my own judgment about anything. The man I'd lived with for over a year, the man I'd planned to marry, had revealed himself to be capable of imprisoning me in my own home. How could I ever trust myself to recognize danger again? How could I ever feel safe with anyone? Nightmares were relentless. I'd wake up in a panic, convinced I was still trapped in that room, still at David's mercy, still listening to his voice through the door, explaining why my imprisonment was actually proof of his love. I couldn't sleep with the bedroom door closed. I couldn't be in small spaces without feeling claustrophobic. I couldn't have serious conversations with men without wondering if they were trying to manipulate me the way David had. Work became my refuge, the one place where I felt competent and useful and valuable. But even there, David's psychological abuse had lasting effects. He had convinced me that my relationships with male colleagues were inappropriate, that my dedication to my job was selfish, that my independence was evidence of my inability to commit to love. It took months of therapy to separate his twisted interpretations from the reality of who I was and what I valued. The hardest part was helping Sarah process what had happened. She'd saved my life, but she'd also been exposed to a level of adult dysfunction and violence that no 16-year-old should have to handle. She blamed herself for not seeing the warning signs, for liking David in the beginning, for not somehow preventing what happened to me. I should have known, she said during one of our many conversations about that weekend. I should have seen that he was controlling you, changing you. I should have said something. You were 16, I reminded her. It wasn't your job to protect me from him, and even if you had said something, I probably wouldn't have listened. I thought I knew what I was doing. I thought I could handle him. But Sarah's guilt was nothing compared to my own. I was the adult in the situation. I was the one who'd invited David into our home, into our lives, into positions where he could hurt both of us. I was the one who'd ignored the warning signs, who'd made excuses for his controlling behavior, who'd allowed him to isolate me from friends and support systems that might have helped me recognize the danger sooner. The therapy helped slowly and sometimes painfully. Dr. Williams, the counselor I started seeing a month after David's arrest, specialized in domestic violence and psychological abuse. She helped me understand that what David had done was part of a recognizable pattern, that his behavior wasn't a result of my failures, but of his own psychological pathology. Abusers are skilled at identifying vulnerable people, she explained during one of our early sessions. They know how to present themselves as exactly what their victims need most. David didn't choose you randomly. He chose you because you were a single mother who was exhausted and isolated and hungry for partnership. He studied your vulnerabilities and exploited them systematically. Learning about the psychology of abuse was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it helped me understand that I hadn't been uniquely stupid or blind. David's manipulation tactics worked on many people, which was why he used them. Terrifying because it revealed how calculated his behavior had been, how deliberately he'd set out to break down my independence and self-confidence. The goal of psychological abuse, Dr. Williams explained, is to make the victim question their own reality, their own judgment, their own worth. David spent months convincing you that your instincts were wrong, that your concerns were unreasonable, that your independence was selfishness. By the time he locked you in that room, he'd already imprisoned your ability to trust yourself. The process of rebuilding that trust in myself, in my judgment, in my right to have boundaries and make decisions about my own life took years. I had to relearn how to recognize manipulation, how to trust my instincts when something felt wrong, how to maintain my independence even within loving relationships. Um, I also had to learn how to forgive myself for the choices I'd made, for the warning signs I'd ignored, for the ways I'd allowed David to isolate me from people who might have helped. Self-forgiveness, Dr. Williams told me, was often harder than forgiving others, but it was essential for healing. You made the best decisions you could with the information you had at the time, she reminded me repeatedly. You were dealing with someone who was skilled at deception, manipulation, and psychological control. The fact that you eventually recognized the danger and escaped, with Sarah's help, shows tremendous strength, not weakness. Slowly, painfully, I began to rebuild my life. I threw myself into work, earning certifications that allowed me to specialize in emergency nursing. I repaired relationships with friends I'd lost touch with during David's campaign of isolation. I learned to live alone again, to make decisions without consulting anyone else, to trust my own judgment, even when it conflicted with what others thought I should do. Most importantly, I learned to see my survival as evidence of strength rather than luck. I'd endured 2 days of psychological torture designed to break my spirit, and I'd emerged with my sense of self intact. I'd faced the worst kind of betrayal by someone who claimed to love me, and I'd found the courage to rebuild my capacity for trust and love. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen quickly, but it did happen. 3 years after David's conviction, I was a different person than the woman who'd been trapped in that room. Stronger, wiser, more careful about who I trusted, but also more confident in my ability to survive whatever challenges life might bring. Sitting here on my front porch 37 years later, watching the evening light paint everything in shades of gold and amber, I can hardly believe I'm the same person who once spent 2 days locked in a room by a man who claimed to love me. But I am that person, and I'm also the woman she became. A woman who learned that surviving doesn't just mean staying alive. It means refusing to let trauma define the rest of your story. I'm 76 years old now, and I've lived more than 3 decades since those dark 48 hours with David. 3 decades of building a life based on my own choices rather than someone else's control. 3 decades of relationships built on mutual respect rather than possession and manipulation. 3 decades of proving to myself every single day that I'm stronger than I ever imagined I could be. I never married again, though I had several meaningful relationships over the years. None of them progressed to marriage, and for a long time I thought that was because David had damaged my ability to trust, had made me too cautious and suspicious to ever fully open my heart again. But as I got older, I realized that my reluctance to remarry wasn't about fear. It was about wisdom. I had learned the difference between healthy love and possessive love, between partnership and control, between someone who wanted to share my life and someone who wanted to own it. The men I dated after David had to accept that I would always maintain my independence, always keep my own bank account, always make my own decisions about my career and my life. Some of them couldn't handle dating a woman who'd learned to protect herself so fiercely. But the ones who stayed, the ones who became important parts of my life, understood that my strength wasn't a rejection of love. It was evidence of how much I valued myself. Sarah grew up to be a remarkable woman, though I know the experience with David affected her in ways that took years to fully understand. She became fiercely protective of the people she loved, quick to recognize controlling behavior in others, unwilling to tolerate disrespect or manipulation in any of her relationships. She married a gentleman who treats her like an equal partner, and they've raised two daughters who know their worth and won't settle for less than they deserve. You taught me that, Sarah told me on my 70th birthday when we were talking about the lessons she'd learned from watching me rebuild my life. You taught me that surviving something terrible doesn't make you broken, it makes you strong. You taught me that love should make you feel more like yourself, not less.
I spent the last 20 years of my nursing career specializing in emergency medicine, and I can't count the number of women I encountered who were trapped in situations similar to what I'd experienced with David. Sometimes they came in with obvious injuries from domestic violence, but more often they came in with stress illnesses, anxiety attacks, depression, and other symptoms of psychological abuse that were harder to recognize, but no less devastating.
I learned to read the signs, the way they'd apologize for everything, the way they'd look toward the door when their partners left the room, the way they'd minimize their own pain and make excuses for behavior that was clearly unacceptable. I learned to ask the right questions to create opportunities for them to talk safely, to provide resources and support for those who were ready to seek help. Has anyone ever hurt you or made you feel unsafe? Became one of the most important questions in my professional vocabulary. And when the answer was yes, spoken or unspoken, I knew how to respond with compassion rather than judgment, with resources rather than advice, with validation rather than skepticism. And some of those women I was able to help directly, connecting them with shelters and counselors and legal advocates who could assist them in escaping dangerous situations. Others weren't ready to leave, weren't able to see their situations clearly, weren't prepared to accept help, but I'd plant seeds, provide information, let them know that someone believed them and that resources would be available when they were ready to use them. You can't save everyone. Dr. Williams had told me years earlier when I had expressed frustration about the women who returned to abusive partners despite having opportunities to leave. But you can be there when someone is ready to save themselves. Sometimes that's enough to make all the difference. I learned that trauma doesn't follow a timetable, that healing doesn't happen in neat stages, that strength can look like many different things depending on what someone needs to survive their particular circumstances. My escape had been dramatic and relatively quick, but other women's journeys took years or decades, involving multiple attempts to leave and complex obstacles that made immediate escape impossible. The important thing wasn't the speed of their recovery. It was their refusal to give up, their determination to keep looking for opportunities to reclaim their lives, their commitment to believing that they deserved better than what they were getting. 10 years ago, long after I'd retired from nursing, I started volunteering with a local domestic violence organization, helping to train healthcare workers and social service providers to recognize signs of abuse and respond appropriately. It felt like the perfect way to use everything I'd learned from my own experience and my decades of professional work with survivors. Your story matters, the program coordinator told me during my first training session. When you tell other professionals about what you experienced, about what helped you heal and what didn't, you're giving them tools they can use to help other survivors. You're turning your worst experience into something that can protect and empower other people. That perspective transformed how I thought about those 2 days in that locked room. They were still the worst 48 hours of my life, still a source of pain and anger and occasional nightmares. But they were also the foundation for everything strong and wise and compassionate that I'd become afterward. They were the experience that taught me what I was capable of surviving, what I was worth fighting for, what kinds of love and treatment I would and wouldn't accept in my life. The work with other survivors also taught me something important about forgiveness. For years, people had asked me whether I'd forgiven David, whether I'd found peace with what he'd done to me. I'd always struggled with that question because forgiveness felt like something he didn't deserve, something that might minimize the seriousness of his crimes. But through my work with other survivors, I learned that forgiveness isn't about the perpetrator, it's about the victim. It's about refusing to let someone else's actions continue to poison your life long after the immediate danger has passed. It's about choosing your own emotional freedom over the satisfaction of holding on to anger and resentment. I did eventually forgive David, not because he deserved it, but because I deserved to be free of the weight of hating him. That forgiveness didn't mean forgetting what he'd done or minimizing the impact it had on my life. It just meant choosing to focus my energy on building something positive rather than maintaining something negative. David died 5 years ago of a heart attack at age 73. I learned about it through a mutual acquaintance, and I felt nothing, not satisfaction, not sadness, not relief, just a kind of neutral acknowledgement that someone who'd once been central to my life was no longer part of the world. His death didn't change anything about my healing or my story. The work I'd done to rebuild my life, to help other survivors, to turn my trauma into wisdom and strength, all of that existed independent of whether David was alive or dead. My healing had never been about him anyway. It had always been about me, about my choices, about my refusal to let his actions define my future. If you're watching this and you're in a situation that feels controlling or frightening or wrong, I want you to know that trust your instincts. If something feels off about your relationship, if someone is isolating you from friends and family, if you're being told that your concerns are unreasonable or that your independence is selfish, trust yourself. You're not overreacting. You're not being too sensitive. You're not asking for too much. Love should make you feel more like yourself, not less. It should expand your world, not shrink it. It should support your growth and independence, not demand that you surrender your autonomy as proof of your devotion. If you're a friend or family member of someone who might be in an abusive situation, be patient and supportive without being judgmental. Don't demand that they leave immediately or make ultimatums about cutting contact if they're not ready to escape. Instead, let them know you believe them, that you're available when they need support, that resources exist when they're ready to use them. Most importantly, remember that surviving trauma doesn't make you broken. It makes you resilient. It doesn't make you damaged goods. It makes you wise. It doesn't disqualify you from love and happiness. It teaches you what healthy love and genuine happiness actually look like. The evening light has faded now, and the first stars are beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Soon I'll go inside to my peaceful house, to my comfortable routine, to my restful sleep, untroubled by fear or nightmares. Tomorrow, I'll wake up grateful for another day of freedom, another day of choices that are mine alone to make. But first, I want to say this. If you're trapped, literally or figuratively, there is always hope. There is always the possibility of escape, of healing, of building something beautiful from the pieces of what was broken. You are stronger than you know. You deserve better than you're getting. And your story, whatever it is, doesn't end with the worst thing that's ever happened to you. It ends with what you choose to do next. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring enough to hear it. And if you know someone who needs to hear it, please share it. Every voice raised makes the world a little safer. Every story told makes it a little easier for the next person to find the courage to speak their truth. And every survivor who refuses to stay silent makes it a little harder for predators to hide in the darkness. The light always wins. Eventually. It always has. It always will.